Okay, now moving on to actually learning the material. I think the core piece of advice that we have here is that DSA ultimately becomes an exercise in pattern recognition. So, and this is like part of the inflection point that I mentioned before, like when you kind of get the matrix vision and you realize like what you've actually been doing all along. So once you like hit the inflection point, you'll realize that like I think I would say at least 75 to 80% of problems fall within 10 to 15 common patterns. Like sliding windows is a pattern, and then just like tree searches like DFS or BFS, those are also patterns, tails and recursion. So your mindset going into problems, like if you see a problem that you've never seen before, is just start cycling through the patterns in your head. Just be like, okay, I can use a tree to solve this. Can I use like a linked list? Can I use tails and recursion or something? So because you're like doing problems, just make a note of like, okay, what pattern did this solution end up falling into? Because there's no way that you can memorize like 100 to 150 to 200 individual solutions to problems. Like I know that a lot of like folks when they're in school, and I think um, like a lot of schools in Asia in particular, like focus a lot more on this kind of drill and kill memorization method. I don't think that works with DSA. It's just not scalable. Just like memorizing everything, it's much more scalable to memorize patterns than to memorize individual solutions.
Mhm.
Yeah, and then something that I found helpful was to extensively comment your solutions. So you're generally going to solve the problems, and you're going to go back to them at some point just to refresh your knowledge. If you don't comment your solutions, you're going to end up going back to the problem that you solved and like not knowing how you did it. So this is essentially how I prepped for Facebook. Whenever I solved a problem, I would write like some amount of comments at the top of the problem, essentially explaining like how the problem works in as plain English as possible. And drawing back to the prior point, I would try to identify the pattern. I'd be like, okay, this solution requires like a heap or something. Like that's the core pattern that solves this problem. And this is also like a good like resource going like when you comment your solutions, and in general when you write stuff down, it's much better for learning, right? I think it's something like if you just read something, your chance of retaining it over like like 1 or 2 month period is only 5%, but like once you write it down, it shoots up to like 15-20%. So after you solve a problem, like in order to really solidify like a true learning of it, just like write down like how you did it, because like again, you can't memorize the code. People don't remember code. You write code, you don't remember code. It's so long and like complicated that you just can't physically remember it. Yeah, and then I think the next one is interesting, but this is essentially what I ended up doing from preparing for Facebook, and this is kind of harkening back to the prior concept of like being flexible and like building the muscle of filling in the gaps and connecting the dots together. When you are looking at a problem and you just you can't figure it out, what I recommend doing is don't just give up completely and then there's like look at the answer and read the entire answer. So generally on Leetcode, you have like you can go to the answer like discussion and answer section, and then people will have the entire code snippet of what worked for them and then explain it in great detail. Don't just give up and just read that entire thing. You want to go back to building the flexible and nimble muscle. So when I was unable to solve a problem, I would go to the solution, and then this is a bit tricky because it's all on one page. I would only read the first line or two of them explaining their solution. I would grab that and then go back to my coding window and put that in. So I'm essentially not giving myself the entire solution. I'm only giving, like 10 or 15%. That essentially high level description of like how the solution works, and then trying to build the muscle of can I convert this like 1 or 2 liner into a functional solution, which is the next point. So essentially the process is, especially if you get a problem on the interview that you've seen before, like you're not going to be able to know the entire solution line by line, and that's also pretty unhealthy anyways, because if you regurgitate the entire solution perfectly line by line, the interviewer is not going to get much signal on your ability. They just know that you've memorized it, and they'll probably make you do another problem. But if you only know like that one liner that describes like the gotcha moment or the pattern that you used to do the problem, and then you kind of organically branch out from there, like from that like short high level description of how the solution works, then it's much more organic. It's much more scalable for you to remember these things, and then it also gives a much better signal for your interviewer, because like it actually shows your brain working through how to convert like these concepts into a functional solution. Yeah,
Yeah,
Rahul, anything to add here?
yeah. I think the third bullet point in particular, I really like that, and I know Alex has used it to great success, and I've also been experimenting. I like learned about this from Alex actually, and been doing it, and I think that this idea of tolerating discomfort for a little bit longer periods of time, in many instances, that insight, like that ability to tolerate discomfort, that is the key to success. So rather than viewing it as a binary thing of, okay, I'm trying for the problem for 5 minutes and then I'm going to give up and look at the solution, I really think that figuring out how to get a hint from the interviewer, or maybe looking at the first couple sentences of the problem solution and then going back and struggling again, that really is where a lot of the learning will happen. So I think whatever system you come up with is probably going to work, but just be diligent about, not completely flipping over to reading the solution. Give yourself an opportunity to struggle.